During a lavish and seemingly cozy family dinner, my son and daughter-in-law suddenly slammed a nursing home brochure onto the table and said, "Dad, we've already signed you up for the best place." I remained silent for a moment and simply replied, "I understand," before standing up and walking away. But what I do next, they will not know that it will force them to pay a heavy price and beg for my forgiveness. Welcome to our story today. Please like, subscribe, and let us know where you are watching from. This is a work of fiction with a deep and useful message. Any coincidence in names or settings is purely accidental. Please leave a comment to connect and share your perspective. The wind out of the Bay of Fundy doesn't just blow, it carves. It's a jagged, salt-heavy chill that finds the gaps in your layers and reminds you exactly how fragile a human body is compared to the North Atlantic. I stood on the edge of Pier 7, the collar of my heavy wool coat turned up against the sleet. It was a Tuesday in late October 2025, and the sky was the color of a bruised plum. Before me, 3 massive container ships, vessels the size of horizontal skyscrapers, were inching toward their berths. This was my world. For 31 years, I managed port operations here in St. John. I was the man who looked at a chaotic puzzle of cargo manifests, shifting tides, and union grumbles, and turned it into a clockwork reality. When a February storm hits and the temperature drops to -18, and someone tells you a critical manifest has been misplaced, you don't panic. You find the solution. You coordinate. You command. You learn to see the things other people miss, the slight hesitation in a crane operator's move, the subtle shift in the wind that could send $1 billion of freight crashing into the dock. I retired 4 years ago. I thought I had left the manifests behind. I thought my days were meant for slow drip coffee, the Sunday crossword, and the quiet satisfaction of the tomatoes I grew in my backyard on Wentworth Street. I was 70 clear-eyed, and by every measurable standard of the province of New Brunswick, perfectly fine. But then came the invitation. Spencer, my only son, had called on Friday. He sounded different, polished yet thin, like a man reading from a script he hadn't quite memorized. He said Bridget was making her signature roast chicken, and they wanted to catch up. I drove the 40 minutes to their place in Sussex, with a bottle of decent Cabernet, and the naive expectation of seeing my grandkids, Silas and Celia. The house was too quiet when I arrived. The kids were already upstairs, tucked away. The air in their living room felt heavy, pressurized, like the atmosphere right before a major weather front breaks. Bridget greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a practiced cosmetic warmth. "Douglas, you look tired," she said, taking my coat. "Have you been sleeping okay? The house on Wentworth must be so much work to keep up with lately." I noticed the exchange of looks then, a micro-expression between her and Spencer. In the port, if a tugboat captain looked at a pilot like that, it meant something was about to go sideways. I said nothing. I sat. I ate the chicken, which was in fact excellent. We talked about the weather, the rising cost of heating oil in Canada, and the mundane details of their lives. But the manifest was already on the table. Not literally, not yet. It was in the way Spencer kept checking his phone, the way his leg bounced under the mahogany table, and the way Bridget kept steering the conversation towards safety and peace of mind. After the plates were cleared, Spencer didn't bring out dessert. Instead, he reached over to a small side table and picked up a manila folder. He placed it right where his dinner plate had been. He didn't open it. He just rested his hand on it, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the heavy paper. "Dad," he started, his voice dropping into a tone of forced concern. "Bridget and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about your legacy." "My legacy?" I asked, leaning back. I kept my voice flat, the same voice I used when a ship was drifting too close to the rocks. "The house is big, Dad. It's old. and after Mom. After Miriam left us 8 years ago, we've been worried. We looked into some options. There's a place just outside Moncton, high-end, a care home with a specialized garden program. They have a waiting list, but we managed to get your name on it. We think it's time you moved into a place where people can look after you. I looked at the folder. I didn't need to see the documents inside to know what they were. I could see the edge of the form's legal jargon medical assessments they hadn't consulted me on, probably a power of attorney draft. They had been building a case. Over the last 3 months, every "How are you feeling, Dad?" and "Are you sure you should be driving in this weather?" Night was a brick in a wall they were building around my freedom. Spencer was 40. He sat there in his expensive sweater, his eyes darting toward the folder and then back to me. He looked like a man who thought he was in control of the schedule. He thought I was just a cargo ship with a failing engine ready to be towed into a scrapyard. He didn't realize that I knew every inch of this harbor. I knew where the sandbars were. I knew how to navigate a storm that he couldn't even see on his radar yet. Bridget leaned forward, her voice a soft, manipulative whisper. "It's for the best, Douglas. We just want you to be safe. We want to help." I didn't get angry. Anger is a luxury for the unprepared. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I thought about the house on Wentworth Street, the house Miriam chose, the house that was mine. I thought about the fact that I was 70, and I was the only person at this table who wasn't hiding a secret. I reached out and placed my hand on top of Spencer's. His skin felt clammy. I didn't pull the folder away. I just felt the weight of it. In my mind, I was already looking at the new manifest, the one I was going to write. I looked my son directly in the eyes. I saw the fear behind his practiced concern, the desperation he thought he was masking. He wasn't worried about my safety. He was worried about something else entirely. "I understand," I said. My voice was steady, professional, and utterly devoid of the weakness they were hoping for. The headlights of my sedan cut through the pitch-black stretch of Highway 1 like a pair of surgical lasers. Outside the New Brunswick wilderness was a wall of shadow, occasional patches of skeletal trees flashing by in the periphery. Usually, the hour-long drive from Sussex back to St. John was a time for reflection, a peaceful transition from the chaos of family to the sanctuary of my own home. But tonight, the silence inside the car was vibrating. I kept my hands at 10 and 2, my grip steady, though my knuckles were white. I wasn't speeding. I was doing exactly 100 kilometers per hour, the limit. I knew Spencer and Bridget might be watching even from miles away, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for a slip-up they could add to their growing folder. I understand. I had said those words to end the dinner, to stop the suffocating weight of their practiced pity. But as the miles hummed beneath my tires, my mind began to do what it had been trained to do for over 3 decades. I began to audit the manifest. In the port, a disaster never starts with a massive explosion. It starts with a series of small, ignored deviations. A mislabeled container here, a slightly late tugboat there, a sensor that someone decided to bypass because they were in a hurry. When you look back at the wreckage, you see the pattern. And tonight, for the first time, I saw the pattern they had been weaving around me for the last 90 days. It started in August, a Sunday afternoon, so humid, the air felt like wet wool. Bridget had dropped by with the kids. We were in the kitchen, and I was reaching for a glass on the top shelf. I fumbled it just a fraction of an inch, and it shattered in the sink. A normal occurrence for anyone regardless of age. But Bridget didn't laugh it off. She froze. She didn't help me clean it up. She just stood there with a look of staged horror, whispering, "Oh, Douglas, your coordination. It's getting worse, isn't it?" Then there was the driving incident. 18 months ago in a crowded Sobeys parking lot, I had tapped a bollard while reversing at a speed so slow a snail could have outrun me. There wasn't even a scratch on the paint. But over the last 3 months, Bridget had brought it up no less than 7 times. She did it in front of friends, in front of the grandkids, always with that saccharine, tilting head. "We're just so worried about your reflexes, Douglas. Maybe you should let Spencer take the keys for a while for everyone's safety." It wasn't concern. It was evidence gathering. Every time I forgot where I'd placed my reading glasses, every time I paused for a second to remember a neighbor's name, they were there, mentally taking notes, building a profile of a man losing his grip. Spencer's role was different. He was the financier, the auditor of my mortality. 2 weeks ago, he'd sat in my living room on Wentworth Street, staring at the crown molding with a predatory squint. "The upkeep on a house this old must be astronomical now, Dad," he'd said unprompted. "Have you updated your will lately? With the market the way it is in St. John, it would be a shame if things got complicated later on." I thought he was being a dutiful son. I thought he was worried about my workload. But sitting in the dark of my car, the truth hit me with the force of an incoming tide. They weren't worried about my health. They were terrified of my autonomy. They were gaslighting me, systematically eroding my confidence in my own mind so they could step in as saviors and take the wheel. The manila folder at dinner wasn't a suggestion. It was a verdict. They had already convicted me of being old, and the sentence was a room in Moncton where I'd be allowed to grow tomatoes in a plastic tub until I faded away. By the time I saw the lights of the reversing Falls Bridge, my heart was no longer racing. It had slowed to a heavy, rhythmic thud. I felt a cold, sharp clarity I hadn't felt since a labor strike nearly shut down the docks in '98. They thought I was a sinking ship. They thought they could scuttle me and claim the salvage. What they forgot, what my son in his 40 years of comfortable living had ever learned, was that you don't survive 31 years in port operations by being soft. You survive by being 3 steps ahead of the storm. You survive by knowing exactly which lines to cut to save the vessel. I pulled into the driveway of my house on Wentworth Street. The Victorian structure stood tall and dark, its bay windows reflecting the street lamps like the eyes of an old sentinel. This was Miriam's house. She had picked the wallpaper. She had insisted on the hardwood floors that I polished every spring. It wasn't just real estate to me. It was the last piece of ground I held. I walked inside the floorboards, creaking familiar greetings under my boots. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew this space by heart. I walked up the stairs, each step a confirmation of my strength, my balance, my reality. In the master bathroom, I finally clicked on the light. The fluorescent glow was harsh, unforgiving. I leaned over the sink and looked at the man in the mirror. 70 years of life were etched into my skin, the lines around my eyes from squinting at the sun over the harbor. The gray in my beard, the steadiness in my gaze. My hands weren't shaking. I stared at my reflection, seeing the man Spencer and Bridget wanted to erase. They wanted a ghost, a shell they could move around like a chess piece. They wanted a man who would doubt his own eyes so they could claim his legacy. "Not tonight," I whispered to the empty room. And never. I looked at the phone on the counter. My lawyer, Frances, wouldn't be awake, but I'd be at her office door before her morning coffee was brewed. Spencer wanted to play a game of manifests and folders. Fine, but he was playing on my docks now. And in this harbor, I am the one who decides who stays afloat and who gets swallowed by the tide. I gripped the edge of the marble counter until my knuckles ached. I made a silent vow right there in the cold light of the bathroom. They could have my respect. They could have my time. But they would never, ever take away my freedom. I was Douglas Merritt, and I was still the master of this port. The morning air in St. John arrived with a bite that tasted like iron and sea salt. I stepped out onto my back porch, a mug of black coffee steaming in my hand, and looked down at my garden. The tomato plants, which only a week ago had been heavy with the last of the season's fruit, were now black and shriveled. A killing frost had swept through Wentworth Street while I was sleeping. turning my labor into a graveyard of vine and silt. In my younger days, I would have been frustrated. I would have cursed the unpredictable Atlantic weather. But as I stood there in the gray light of dawn, watching my breath cloud in the air, I felt nothing but a grim sense of familiarity. Nature, like people, has a way of showing you exactly where you stand when the illusion of protection disappears. My garden was gone, but the soil remained, and I was still standing on it. I leaned against the railing, the wood cold even through my flannel shirt, and let my mind drift back 30 years. To be a manager at the Port of St. John in the late 80s wasn't about sitting in an air-conditioned office. It was about standing on the docks at 3 in the morning, facing down a line of 200 angry longshoremen who were ready to shut down the entire province because a contract negotiation had gone sour. I remembered a man named Silas Thorne, no relation to my grandson, thank goodness. Silas was a union rep built like a freight elevator with a temperament to match. He cornered me in a warehouse with 4 men behind him, all carrying heavy wrenches like they were ready to use them. They wanted me to sign off on a manifest that included 3 ghost containers cargo that didn't exist on paper, but carried enough contraband to buy a small island. Sign the sheet, Merritt. Silas had growled the scent of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey rolling off him. You've got a wife at home, a young son. Don't make this complicated. They thought because I had a university degree and a clean shave I was soft. They thought I was a paper pusher who would fold at the first sign of a shadow. What they didn't know was, and I knew that the only way to deal with a shark was to show it you were willing to take its teeth. I didn't sign. I didn't blink. I walked right up into Silas's personal space, close enough to see the broken capillaries in his nose, and I told him exactly which tidal window his body would disappear into if he ever mentioned my family again. I told him I'd already logged the container numbers with the federal authorities, and if I didn't check in by sunrise, the dock would be crawling with more police than he could count. It was a bluff. A high-stakes, cold-blooded lie. But I held his gaze until he saw the steel in mine. I had spent years learning the logistics of cargo, but that night I learned the logistics of power. People only take from you what you allow them to take. Respect in the harbor wasn't given. It was seized and defended every single day. Spencer hasn't seen that man. My son grew up in the comfort of the legacy I built. He saw the retired version of me, the man who reads history books and worries about the pH level of his soil. He saw an old oak and assumed the core had gone soft with rot. He thinks he's dealing with a grandfather who can be pressured into a manila folder by a few comments about safety and peace of mind. He's wrong. I took a long, slow sip of the coffee, letting the heat settle in my chest. Spencer and Bridget are playing at being clever. They think they've built a cage out of gaslighting and staged concern, but they've forgotten who taught them how to navigate. They've forgotten that before I was a retiree, I was the man who kept the most chaotic port on the Atlantic coast, running like a Swiss watch. I've handled strike sabotage, and men far more dangerous than a son who's desperate to pay off his gambling debts. The frost on my tomatoes didn't scare me. It was just a reminder that the season had changed. It was time to stop nurturing and start clearing. I walked back inside the warmth of the house, feeling thick and heavy. I went into my study, a room filled with the smell of old paper and cedar. In the corner, hidden behind a false panel in the built-in bookshelf, sat an old floor safe. It was a heavy cast-iron beast I'd bought at a liquidation sale years ago. Spencer definitely thinks it's empty or filled with nothing but old tax returns. I knelt, my knees popping with a sound like dry twigs, but my hands were steady. I dialed the combination. Left to 32, right to 18, left to 7. The heavy mechanism clicked a sound of pure mechanical finality. I swung the door open. Inside was not money or gold. It was my real treasure. I reached past the deeds and the titles until I found a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked with age. This was my personal directory. It contained names and unlisted numbers of the men who used to work for me, men who had gone on to become port authorities, customs officials, and private investigators, men who owed me their careers. I had 31 years of loyalty stored in this safe. Spencer thinks he can use a lawyer and a folder to scuttle me. He's about to find out that when you try to drown someone like me, you'll see just how deep this harbor is. I flipped the pages until I reached the W section. Wallace Ingram. Wallace wasn't just my supervisor. He was the man who had stood beside me when Silas Thorne tried to break my ribs. He was retired now, but his son was a high-ranking officer in the regional police, and his brother ran one of the most discreet private security firms in the Maritimes. I picked up the landline phone on my desk. I didn't want a digital trail. I wanted the old way, the secure way. As the dial tone hummed in my ear, I looked out at the frost-covered yard. The tomatoes were finished, but something else was just beginning to grow. "Wallace," I said as his voice came through the line. "It's Douglas. I need a manifest checked, and I think it's time we discuss some overdue cargo." The master of the port was back on the clock. The glow of my smartphone in the pre-dawn darkness was a cold, clinical blue. I was sitting at the small breakfast nook, the landline receiver still warm from my call to Wallace, when the device buzzed against the mahogany surface. It was a push notification from my banking portal. A transaction alert. Usually, my monthly expenses were as predictable as the tides heating oil. Groceries, property taxes. But this was different. Transaction denied $2,500. Location Casino, New Brunswick, Moncton. A chill that had nothing to do with the October frost crawled up my spine. I hadn't stepped foot in a casino since Miriam and I took a trip to Las Vegas for our 20th anniversary. I looked at the timestamp, 1:14 a.m., while I was lying in bed. Reeling from the psychological ambush at dinner, someone was using a cloned version of my debit card 60 miles away in Moncton. I didn't call the bank to report it stolen. Not yet. In port operations, when you find a leak in a hull, you don't just plug it. You watch the water to see where it's coming from. I knew exactly who had my emergency card, the one kept in the small porcelain jar in the hallway for family emergencies. Spencer had always been family. I stood up, my joints aching, and walked into the small den I used as a home office. On the desk sat an aging desktop computer, the one Spencer used to help me with my digital taxes and social media accounts. He thought I was technologically illiterate, a man stuck in the era of clipboards and carbon paper. He didn't realize that managing a modern port meant overseeing automated logistics systems far more complex than a home operating system. I sat down and nudged the mouse. The screen flickered to life. He had been here yesterday afternoon while I was out grocerying for the very dinner he used to betray me. He must have been in a hurry, or perhaps his arrogance had finally outpaced his caution. The browser was still open. He hadn't just used the computer either. He was in a hurry or too arrogant to think I would ever check. He had stayed logged into a private portal. It wasn't a bank. It was a digital ledger for an offshore betting site, the kind that doesn't care about Canadian regulations or your credit score. My eyes narrowed as I scrolled through the history. It was a chaotic map of desperation. Thousands of dollars moving in and out, mostly out. Basketball games, late-night horse races in Australia, digital poker rooms. The numbers were staggering, but it was the outstanding balance at the bottom of the screen that made my breath hitch in my chest. $204,500. I leaned back the leather chair, creaking under my weight. The puzzle pieces didn't just fit. They locked together with a sickening metallic click. Spencer didn't want me in a care home because he was worried about my safety. He wanted me in a care home because the house on Wentworth Street was his only exit strategy. In the current St. John market, A well-maintained Victorian in this neighborhood would easily fetch 600,000. If he could convince a court I was incompetent, if he could gain power of attorney, he could liquidate my life, pay off his debts to these digital sharks, and walk away with the leftovers. Bridget's concern wasn't about my reflexes. It was about her lifestyle. She knew. She had to know. The expensive sweaters, the private school tuition for Silas and Celia, the new SUV in their driveway, it was all a facade built on the crumbling edge of a massive financial crater. They weren't building a folder to save me. They were building a coffin for my autonomy, so they wouldn't have to face the consequences of their own greed. I felt a surge of nausea, followed by a wave of such intense white-hot clarity that it felt like a physical weight. My son, my only boy, the one I had taught to tie his shoes, the one I had carried on my shoulders through the woods of New Brunswick. He wasn't just waiting for me to fade away. He was actively trying to accelerate the process to cover his tracks. I looked at the porcelain jar in the hallway through the open door. It looked so innocent. Just a piece of decor Miriam had bought at a craft fair in Fredericton. Now it was a crime scene. I reached for my phone and opened my own secure cloud drive. I began taking photos of the computer screen, every transaction, every login ID, every timestamp. I recorded the denied transaction from the casino. I was no longer just a father being pushed around. I was an investigator documenting a betrayal. Spencer thinks I'm a relic of the past. He thinks because I prefer the smell of a paper ledger to the glow of a tablet, I don't understand how the modern world works. He's forgotten that I spent 30 years tracking cargo across the globe. I know how to follow a trail. I know how to spot a discrepancy. And I certainly know how to handle a thief, even if he shares my last name. I shut down the computer, making sure to leave everything exactly as I had found it. I wiped my fingerprints from the mouse and the keyboard with a microfiber cloth. In his world, information is something you use to manipulate. In my world, information is cargo, and I was about to make sure his shipment never reached its destination. I walked back to the kitchen and poured the rest of my cold coffee down the sink. I didn't feel old. I didn't feel tired. I felt like a man who had just discovered a stowaway on his ship, and I knew exactly which port to drop him off at. The manila folder Spencer had placed on the dinner table was filled with forms for a care home in Moncton. He thought he was giving me a graceful exit. But as I looked at the gray light finally breaking over the St. John's skyline, I realized the truth. Their love, their concerns, their supposed filial piety, it all had a price tag. And that price was exactly $200,000 of gambling debt. 20 years of raising you, Spencer, I whispered, my voice echoing in the empty kitchen. And it turns out, you're the one who's morally bankrupt. I picked up my keys. It was time to visit Francis Whitfield. The manifest was changing, and for the first time in 4 years, I was the one holding the pen. The Anchor and Grain is the kind of place where the air smells eternally of fried onions, diesel exhaust, and the kind of dark roast coffee that can jumpstart a heart. It's a sanctuary for the retired ghosts of the St. John waterfront, a place where the modern world feels like a distant, irrelevant rumor. I found Wallace Ingram in his usual booth, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering light of a beer sign. He didn't look up when I slid into the vinyl seat opposite him. He just pushed a second mug of black coffee toward me. You look like a man who just found out his anchor line is frayed. Douglas. Wallace set his voice a low rumble. It's more than frayed, Wally. It's been cut, I replied, taking a slow sip of the scalding liquid. I didn't waste time. I told him about the Sussex dinner, the manila folder, and the $200,000 debt I'd discovered on my office computer. Wallace listened with the disciplined silence of a veteran supervisor. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just watched the steam rise from his cup, his eyes hardening with every detail. When I finished, Wallace leaned forward, his scarred hands interlocking on the Formica tabletop. "It's worse than you think, Doug. Spencer came to see me 3 days ago." I felt a jolt of electricity hit my stomach. "He came to see you. He brought a bottle of expensive scotch and started talking about your episodes. He mentioned the time you supposedly got lost driving home and asked if I'd be willing to sign a witness statement for a guardianship hearing. Said he was worried about your safety." I gripped the mug so hard I thought the ceramic might crack. "And what did he offer you, Wally?" "He didn't get that far," Wallace growled. "I told him that if he didn't get out of my house in the next 10 seconds, I'd show him exactly how much coordination an old longshoreman still has." He left, but Douglas, he looked undeterred. He looked like a man who had already spent the money and was just trying to clear the rubble out of the way. The betrayal was no longer just a private family matter. It was a public campaign. Spencer was trying to poison my oldest relationships, turning my friends into witnesses for my downfall. It was a tactical error. He forgot that men like Wallace and me share a brotherhood forged in the teeth of Atlantic storms. "He's desperate, Doug," Wallace continued. "And desperate men are dangerous because they don't care who they scuttle. You need someone who speaks their language, the language of paper and bloodless destruction." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a plain business card. "Frances Whitfield, attorney at law." "She's the one," Wallace said. "She doesn't just know the law, she knows how to use it as a scalpel. She's sharp, direct, and has a way of making people realize they've made a fatal mistake before they even hear her speak." An hour later, I was standing in the lobby of a glass tower looking out over the Bay of Fundy. The office of Frances Whitfield was silent, smelling of expensive cedar and high-end stationery. Frances was a woman in her mid-50s with iron-gray hair cut into a precise bob and eyes that recorded everything in high definition. She didn't offer a polite smile. She simply gestured to the leather chair across from her desk. "Mr. Merritt," she said, her voice a well-tuned instrument. "Wallace tells me you have a logistics problem. Only it's not cargo, it's kin." I laid it all out: the folder, the casino transaction, the gambling debt, and Spencer's attempt to suborn Wallace. I showed her the photos I'd taken of the computer screen. Frances didn't look shocked. She simply turned the photos over her fingers, tapping a rhythmic beat against the desk. "Your son is attempting a classic gray zone takeover," she said. "It's not illegal to be concerned, but his methods, the forgery, the subornation of witnesses, the unauthorized credit use, those are the cracks we will use to bury him." She leaned back, her gaze locking onto mine. "The house on Wentworth Street is currently in your name, which makes it a target. If he succeeds in a guardianship hearing, he can sell it before you can say objection. We need to move faster than his debt collectors. We need to lock your life into a vault that even a court-appointed hammer can't break." I felt the weight of the last few days finally beginning to shift. I wasn't just a father being betrayed anymore. I was a commander receiving a tactical briefing. "What do we do first?" I asked. "We build a trust," Frances replied, her eyes gleaming with a cold professional hunger. "An irrevocable one. We move the house, the accounts, everything. And we do it while you are demonstrably, medically, and legally competent. We will make it so that even if he wins his little hearing, he wins an empty shell." I stood up, the old strength returning to my legs. The master of the port was no longer just watching the storm. I was directing it. I looked at Frances Whitfield and saw the perfect instrument for the manifest I was about to write. "Frances," Giorgio, I said, my voice as steady as the deep water channel. I want to protect the house, and I want Spencer to pay the full price for choosing the wrong side of this manifest. A few days later, I sat across from Francis again. The fog was rolling in over the Bay of Fundy, a thick silver shroud that swallowed the container cranes and muffled the distant hum of the city. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of Francis Whitfield's office, the world looked like a half-finished sketch. It was the perfect atmosphere for what we were doing, building a fortress out of ink and paper. Francis sat across from me, her desk covered in stacks of legal documents that looked like the blueprints for a complex infrastructure project. She didn't use a laptop for the core drafting. She had a heavy fountain pen that moved across the parchment with a deliberate rhythmic scratching sound. Logistics, Mr. Merritt, is the art of moving something from where it is to where it needs to be without the enemy realizing it's gone. Francis said, her eyes never leaving the page. The house on Wentworth Street, your pension accounts, your life insurance. They are all currently exposed cargo. Spencer sees them on his radar. He thinks he can seize them with a simple court order for guardianship. I watched a lone pilot boat cut through the fog in the harbor below. And the trust. How does that change the manifest? An irrevocable trust is a sovereign territory. She explained, finally looking up. Her gaze was as sharp as a razor. Once we move your assets into the Merritt Family Legacy Trust, you no longer legally own them. The trust does. You are the settler and the primary beneficiary, but you are not the owner in a way that a guardian can exploit. Even if Spencer somehow convinces a judge that you can't manage your own socks, he will find that there is nothing left for him to manage. The trust is managed by a third-party trustee in this case, a secure firm I work with, and its rules are carved in stone. She paused, tapping her pen against her chin. But there is a timeline. This isn't an overnight fix. Between the deed transfers at the land registry office and the bank authorizations, we are looking at roughly 2 weeks before the vault is fully locked. We are in the vulnerable window now. If Spencer files his petition tomorrow, we have a fight on our hands. 2 weeks. In the port, 2 weeks was a lifetime. A ship could be loaded, sailed across the Atlantic, and docked in Rotterdam in less time. I knew I couldn't just sit in my Victorian living room and wait for the ink to dry. I needed a counter-battery. He's building a medical case against me, Francis, I said. He's recording every time I forget a name or trip on a rug. He's going to use a court-appointed doctor who will see a 70-year-old man and see a paycheck. Which is why we aren't going to wait for his doctor, Francis replied with a faint, cold smile. We are going to strike first, but I can't be involved in this part. It has to be untainted by legal coaching. I left her office an hour later with a set of instructions and a renewed sense of purpose. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove 60 miles in the opposite direction of Sussex, toward a private medical complex in Fredericton that had no ties to my local family physician or the hospitals where Spencer had connections. I had made the appointment under a slight variation of my name, paying the consultation fee in cash to avoid a paper trail. I wanted a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation. I wanted the hardest, most grueling mental stress test they had. The hospital smelled of floor wax and quiet efficiency. For 4 hours, I sat in a small, windowless room with a specialist who looked half my age but had eyes like an auditor. He didn't ask me about my feelings. He gave me sequences of numbers to reverse, complex geometric patterns to memorize, and ethical dilemmas to solve. He challenged my memory of historical events and my ability to calculate rapidly changing variables. At one point, he asked me to describe the process of birthing a Neo-Panamax vessel during a spring tide. I didn't just describe it. I mapped it out on the whiteboard in the room. I showed him how I calculated the drag, the windage, and the power requirements for the tugs. I showed him that while my knees might pop when I stand, the computer in my skull was still running at peak capacity. "You're very precise, Mr. Merritt." The doctor noted his pen hovering over his clipboard. "Precision is the only thing that keeps a harbor from becoming a graveyard," I told him. The wait for the results felt longer than the 31 years I'd spent at the port. I sat in the cafeteria, nursing a cup of tea that tasted like cardboard, watching the clock on the wall. I thought about Spencer. I wondered if he was at his desk in Sussex right now, looking at his offshore betting balance and dreaming about the crown molding in my house. I wondered if he felt even a flicker of remorse for trying to bury his father alive. Finally, the nurse called my name. I walked back into the doctor's office. He was holding a single sheet of paper with a blue embossed seal at the bottom. "The results are conclusive," he said, handing me the document. "Your cognitive function is in the top 5% for your age group. Your executive function and memory recall are frankly superior. There is absolutely no evidence of the decline you were concerned about. You are by every clinical definition completely compos mentis." I took the paper. The text was a blur of medical terminology, but the conclusion was a wall of steel. "Patient demonstrates full capacity for self-determination and financial management." I walked out into the cool evening air of Fredericton. The fog hadn't reached this far inland yet, and the stars were beginning to prick through the twilight. I climbed into my car and placed the medical report in the glove box right next to the business card for Francis Whitfield. Spencer thought he was the one writing the manifest. He thought he was the one deciding which cargo was damaged and which was salvageable. But he had forgotten the first rule of the docks. You never assume a vessel is empty just because the lights are out. I had the trust in progress, and now I had the medical shield. I felt a surge of cold, quiet triumph. I wasn't just defending my house anymore. I was preparing for a total blockade. Spencer wanted to play at being a predator fine, but he was about to find out what happens when you try to hunt an old wolf who knows every inch of the forest. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather smooth and solid under my hands. I had my first hole card. I had the completely lucid certification in my hand, and I was ready to let the tide come in. By the end of the second week, everything was in motion. The blue light of the tablet screen illuminated my study, casting long, flickering shadows over the leather-bound books and the old port maps on the wall. It was 9 p.m. in St. John, which meant it was just dinner time in Calgary. On the other side of the video call, my daughter Nadine sat in her kitchen, her face a mask of controlled fury that mirrored my own, though hers was tempered with the fiery impatience of her youth. Nadine had always been the navigator of the family. While Spencer had inherited my penchant for logistics, he lacked the moral compass that Nadine possessed in spades. She worked in corporate law out west, a world of high-stakes contracts and sharp-edged negotiations. She knew a predator when she saw one, even if he shared her last name. "I'm booking a flight, Dad," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the 3,000-mile lag. "I can be at the St. John airport by Tuesday afternoon. I'll walk into that house in Sussex, and I will dismantle Spencer's ego piece by piece until he's begging for your forgiveness. This is beyond betrayal. It's predatory." I looked at her, my heart swelling with a warmth I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. Seeing her ready to go to war for me was the greatest validation of my life. But I shook my head slowly, raising a hand to the camera. "No, Nadine. Stay in Calgary. Stay at your desk. Stay quiet." "Quiet," she hissed, leaning closer to her screen. "He's trying to steal your life, Dad. He's building a cage for you in Moncton so he can pay off some digital sharks." "How can you ask me to be quiet? Because in the harbor, the most dangerous movement is the one the radar doesn't pick up." I said, my voice dropping into that low, steady register I used when a crisis was unfolding on the docks. Spencer and Bridget think they are the only ones playing. They think I am a confused old man who doesn't know a trust from a grocery list. If you show up now shouting and demanding answers, you tip our hand. You turn this into a noisy family feud. I don't want a feud, Nadine. I want a total blockade. I held up the medical report I'd received in Fredericton, letting the blue embossed seal catch the light. I told her about Frances Whitfield and the Merritt Family Legacy Trust. I watched as the lawyer in her began to override the grieving daughter. She understood the mechanics of what I was building. We are moving the Wentworth house and all the liquid assets into an irrevocable structure, I continued. Frances is finalizing the paperwork, but for this to be bulletproof, we need a beneficiary who is demonstrably stable and loyal. I want you to be the primary beneficiary and the co-trustee. Spencer will be excluded entirely from the new manifest. Nadine went silent. I saw her blink back tears, the anger softening into something deeper. Dad, you don't have to do that. I just want you to be safe. I know you do, I said. And that's why it has to be you. Spencer has spent his life looking at my assets as a future payout. He's already spent the money in his head. By making you the owner through the trust, I'm not just protecting the house, I'm removing the motivation for his concern. Once he realizes there is no gold at the end of this rainbow, he'll have to face his debts on his own. We spent the next hour going over the fine print. She pointed out a few clauses that Frances had mentioned, adding her own West Coast legal perspective to our Atlantic defense. It was a strange, bittersweet moment, a father and daughter plotting a legal counterstrike against their own blood. But as I looked at her, I realized that this was the legacy Miriam and I had actually wanted: resilience, loyalty, and the wisdom to know when to strike. He's going to keep pushing, Dad. Nadine warned, her voice calmer now. The gaslighting will get worse. Bridget will try to make you doubt your own eyes. They'll probably stage another incident to show the court. Let them, I replied. Every time they try to manipulate me, they are just providing more evidence for Frances. I've lived through 40-foot tides and union strikes that would make Spencer's head spin. I can handle a few missing car keys and some staged confusion. I could see the lights of Calgary through the window behind her, a city of glass and steel thousands of miles away. The geographical distance felt vast, but for the first time in weeks, the emotional distance felt like it had vanished. I wasn't alone in this harbor anymore. I had a scout on the horizon. Don't call him Nadine, I reminded her as we prepared to end the call. Don't post anything on social media. Don't even send a cryptic text to Bridget. We need them to believe their plan is working perfectly. I want them to feel so confident that they stop being careful. It's going to be hard, Dad, she whispered, unknowing what he's doing to you and acting like everything is fine. Just think of it as a long-range shipment, I told her. The cargo is safe, the route is mapped, and the destination is certain. We just have to let the time pass. She nodded, a small, grim smile finally appearing on her face. I love you, Dad. Stay sharp. I'm a Merritt, Nadine. We don't dull. We just get more dangerous. I tapped the screen and her face vanished, leaving me once again in the quiet of my study. The silence of the house on Wentworth Street felt different now. It wasn't the silence of a victim. It was the silence of a hunter in a blind. Spencer and Bridget were likely sitting in Sussex right now, perhaps browsing real estate listings or looking at luxury cars they couldn't afford, convinced that the old man was finally drifting into the fog. They were counting their haul before the ship had even docked. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the dark street. Let them think they're winning, Nadine, I whispered to the empty room. Because by the time they realize the tide has gone out, they'll be miles away from any shore. The basement of the house on Wentworth Street always smelled of damp earth cedar and the lingering scent of lavender that Miriam used to keep in small muslin bags. Since she left this world 8 years ago, I hadn't spent much time down here. It was a tomb of memories, boxes of my shipping journals, and echoes of a life that felt increasingly like a dream I was being forced to wake up from. I was down there on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to check for a leak in the copper pipes, but my subconscious was searching for something else. I needed to know if the woman who had stood by my side through 31 years of Atlantic winters would approve of the blockade I was building against our only son. In the farthest corner, tucked behind a stack of weathered chairs, sat her steamer trunk. It was a heavy, dark wood chest with brass fittings that had gone dull with time. I sat on a milk crate, my knees protesting the damp cold, and placed my hand on the lid. Miriam had been the quiet strength of the Merritt family. While I was out on the docks managing thousands of tons of steel, she was at home managing the much more complex logistics of the human heart. She saw the things I missed. She heard the notes between the words. I clicked the latches open. The hinges groaned, a sound like a long-held breath finally being released. Inside were baby blankets and a small metal lockbox tucked at the very bottom. I didn't need a key. Miriam always used the same combination the date of our first anniversary. June 12th. The lid popped open. Inside was a thick envelope addressed to me in her elegant, sloping longhand. The postmark was dated just 3 weeks before she passed. My hands, usually as steady as a crane operator's, trembled as I broke the seal. Douglas, the letter began. If you are reading this, the shadows have grown too long. I am writing this because there is a weight on my heart that I cannot take with me. It concerns Spencer. I have watched him these last few years, Douglas. I have seen the way he looks at your success, not with pride, but with a ledger in his eyes. He has a hunger in him that I don't recognize, a desperate need for the easy path. I caught him twice trying to access your private accounts while you were at the docks. He told me he was helping, but his eyes were full of a frantic greed that scared me. I leaned against the stone foundation, the paper crinkling in my grip. Miriam had known. While I was busy being a provider, being the master of the port, she had been a sentry, watching our son become a stranger. I didn't tell you then, because I didn't want to break your heart while you were still carrying the weight of the harbor on your shoulders. But I knew that one day, his debts would come calling. In this box, you will find the deed to a small plot of land in Prince Edward Island and a savings passbook. I have been tucking away my inheritance and small earnings for years. It is not a fortune, but it is a shield. Use it if he ever tries to corner you, Douglas. Use it to stay free. I looked into the box. Under the letter lay a stack of $100 bills neatly banded and a passbook showing a balance of nearly $40,000. It wasn't enough to retire twice over, but it was enough to fuel a legal war. More importantly, it was a message from the past. Miriam hadn't just left me memories. She had left me a manifest for survival. She had seen Spencer's trajectory long before he ever placed that manila folder on the dinner table. She knew his concern would eventually become a weapon. A wave of grief washed over me, sharper than any I had felt in years. I missed her so much, it felt like a physical ache. But as the grief receded, it left behind something harder, something permanent. I thought about Spencer. I thought about how he had sat at her funeral, crying those hollow, performative tears, all while he was likely calculating the value of the silver in the dining room. He had betrayed my trust, but he had also betrayed her love. He had ignored the grace she tried to instill in him, choosing instead the path of a scavenger. The pain didn't vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer a weight. It was high-octane fuel. I wasn't just defending a house anymore. I wasn't just protecting a pension. I was fulfilling Miriam's final wish. I was being the man she knew I was, the man who doesn't let the cargo get stolen on his watch. I tucked the letter into my breast pocket, right against my heart. I closed the trunk, the brass latches clicking with a sound of absolute finality. Spencer thought he was the only one with secrets. He thought he was playing a game against a lonely widower who had lost his edge. He didn't realize that I had an ally who knew his every weakness before he even knew them himself. I walked up the basement stairs, my stride firm, my gaze fixed on the light at the top. The damp cold of the cellar stayed behind. I felt a surge of powerful, quiet energy. Miriam had given me the final piece of the puzzle. She had given me the why to match my how. I wasn't just fighting for my freedom. I was fighting for the honor of the life we had built together. I hear you, Miriam, I whispered as I reached the kitchen. The manifest is clear, and I'm going to make sure the merit name still stands for something when the tide finally comes in. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 p.m. on a Saturday. I stood in the hallway for a moment, adjusted my cardigan to look slightly disheveled, and let out a long, shaky breath. I wasn't just Douglas Merritt anymore. I was a character in a play that Spencer and Bridget had written. Only I had rewritten the ending. When I opened the door, they were standing there with a basket of muffins and expressions of such exaggerated concern that I almost felt a wave of nausea. "Hi, Dad," Spencer said, his voice dropping into that patronizing, low frequency he used for the elderly. "We just wanted to drop by. You sounded a bit off on the phone yesterday." "Oh, did I?" I blinked slowly, letting my gaze wander past him as if I were struggling to focus. "I suppose. The house is just so big. Hard to keep track of the days." Bridget stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room like a bird of prey. "Of course it is, Douglas. That's exactly what we've been saying. Here, let me help you with those dishes." They followed me into the kitchen. I moved with a deliberate stiffness, letting my hand tremble as I reached for a glass. While Spencer engaged me in a circular conversation about the heating bill, I watched Bridget through the reflection in the polished chrome of the toaster. She thought she was being subtle. She moved toward the counter where I kept my daily pill organizer, the one containing my essential blood pressure medication. With a quick motion, she swept the orange plastic bottle into her pocket. "Douglas, dear," she said, turning back with a predatory smile. "Did you take your afternoon dose? I don't see the bottle on the counter." I turned around, feigning a look of sudden, panicked confusion. I began patting my pockets, my breath coming in short bursts. It was. Right there. I'm certain of it. Or was it in the bathroom? I can't remember. "See? Spencer." Bridget sighed. "This is what we were talking about. It's the second time this week he's misplaced his medication. It's getting dangerous, Dad. What if you have a medical emergency because you can't find your pills?" Spencer placed a heavy, controlling hand on my shoulder. "It's okay, Dad. But you have to admit, this is becoming a pattern. Even the kids noticed last time. Silas was quite upset that you forgot his soccer team's name." I looked down at the floor, letting my lip quiver. "Silas?" "Yes. The boy. He's playing for the Blue Jays." Spencer's eyes lit up with a dark, triumphant spark. "Silas played for the Sea Dogs. The Blue Jays, Dad, that's baseball. Silas plays soccer. You knew that a month ago." I sank into a chair, burying my face in my hands. I played the part of a man whose world was dissolving into fog. I let them lecture me on the benefits of the Moncton care home, listening to them describe it as if it were a luxury resort, rather than a place where they intended to dump me so they could liquidate the house. What they didn't know was that the small decorative smoke detector I had installed last week was actually a 4K wide-angle lens with a high-gain microphone, streaming every second of this performance to an encrypted cloud server. I saw Bridget move to the hallway thinking she was out of sight. She reached into her pocket, pulled out my medication bottle, and tucked it deep inside the porcelain umbrella stand. She was planting the evidence of my confusion for when they would discover it later. It was a cold-blooded act of cruelty. They were willing to risk my health just to build their legal case. As I sat there pretending to be broken, any lingering shred of guilt I felt about excluding Spencer from the trust vanished. Maybe you're right, I whispered, looking up with watery eyes. Maybe I do need help. Bridget practically glowed. She patted my hand, her touch feeling like the crawl of a spider. We're just so glad you're finally seeing it, Douglas. We'll take care of everything. Thank you, I said, my voice barely audible. Thank you, Spencer. And you too, Brenda. I saw her flinch at the wrong name, but she quickly covered it with a smirk. To her, it was just more ammunition for the folder. When they finally left, Spencer squeezed my hand with a grip that felt like a shackle. We'll be back on Tuesday with the final papers, Dad. I watched from the window as they walked to their SUV. Bridget was leaning toward Spencer, her head thrown back in a silent laugh. She was celebrating the ease of their victory, thinking the old man was a ghost of his former self. I waited until their taillights vanished. Then I stood up. The disheveled look vanished. My back straightened. I walked to the umbrella stand, retrieved my medication, and took my dose. Then I went to my study and watched the playback. There it was in high definition. Bridget stealing the bottle, Spencer's predatory smirk, their whispered conversation about liquidating the assets, while I was sitting 5 feet away. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. They thought they were the ones conducting the gaslight game. Checkmate, Spencer, I whispered to the empty room. I sent the video file to Francis Whitfield with a single-word subject line: evidence. Bridget was still laughing in my head, but I knew the tide was about to come in with a vengeance they weren't prepared to survive. The vibration of my phone on the nightstand at 11:45 p.m. sounded like a rattlesnake in the quiet of my bedroom. I hadn't been sleeping. I was busy rewatching the footage from the smoke detector camera, cataloging every one of Bridget's predatory smiles. But the message that flashed across the screen wasn't from Francis or Wallace. It was from an unknown number. Sobeys parking lot. Far corner near the recycling bins. 15 minutes. Come alone or I call the police and tell them you're a danger to yourself tonight. I didn't hesitate. I threw on my coat, grabbed my keys, and headed out into the biting November air. The drive to the Sobeys on Westmoreland Road took less than 10 minutes. The lot was a vast, desolate sea of asphalt under the orange hum of high-pressure sodium lights. I spotted Bridget's SUV idling in the shadows of the loading bay away from the storefront cameras. I pulled up beside her and stepped out. The wind was whipping off the bay sharp enough to draw tears from my eyes. Bridget was leaning against her door, her expensive wool coat wrapped tightly around her. She looked different than she had 6 hours ago. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a jagged, frantic energy. Her mascara was smudged, and her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold her cigarette. "You're late, Douglas," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "I'm exactly on time for a man of my supposed condition," I replied, my voice cold. What do you want, Bridget? Did you forget another bottle of pills you wanted to hide in my house? She flinched, her eyes darting around the empty lot. Cut the act. I know you're not as gone as Spencer thinks you are. I saw your eyes tonight when I took the meds. You were watching me. You were letting it happen. I leaned against my car, crossing my arms. And if I was, it's not a crime to watch your daughter-in-law reveal her true character. My character. She let out a short, hysterical laugh that turned into a cough. You think I'm the villain here, Douglas. I'm a passenger on a plane that's currently screaming toward a mountain. Spencer isn't just in debt. He's underwater. Those betting sites. They aren't just offshore businesses. He's been borrowing from people in the city who don't use court orders to collect. They use baseball bats. I felt the ironclad resolve in my chest tighten. I saw the balance, Bridget. 200,000. That was 2 weeks ago, she hissed, stepping closer. It's doubled. Interest, late fees, and more desperate bets to cover the spread. He's lost everything. Our savings, the kids' college funds, the equity in our own house, it's all gone. And here's the part you'll love. He's not planning on taking us to Moncton with you. His plan is to get you declared incompetent, sell the Wentworth house in a fire sale, take the cash, and disappear. He's already got a flight booked to Panama. 1 ticket, Douglas. Not 4. 1. The air felt suddenly very thin. I had expected greed. I had expected a lack of conscience, but the calculated abandonment of his own children was a level of depravity I hadn't mapped out on my manifest. Why tell me this? I asked. You were laughing with him when you left my house today. Because I'm not going down with his ship, she said, her voice turning sharp and pragmatic. I found his travel documents and the liquidation agreement he's been drafting with a shady real estate firm. If he leaves, the sharks will come for me and the kids. I need protection. I need a way out that doesn't involve me ending up on the street or worse. She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy envelope. Everything is in here. The original betting ledgers he printed out, the forged power of attorney documents he was practicing, and the contact information for the people he owes. It's enough to ensure he never sees a cent of your estate. It's enough to bury him. I looked at the envelope, but didn't take it yet. And the price, Bridget, the trust, she whispered. Nadine told me about it. She slipped up on a call last night. I want you to include a clause that provides a protected fund for Silas and Celia, and I want a legal guarantee that when Spencer is removed from the picture, I get enough to start over somewhere else. You protect the grandkids, and I'll give you the head of the man who's trying to destroy you. I stared at her, seeing the desperation of a cornered animal. She wasn't doing this out of love for me, or even remorse for the gaslighting. She was doing it for survival. She was the weak link in Spencer's chain, the cargo that had shifted during the storm. The enemy of my enemy is my ally, I muttered. Is that a yes? She asked, her eyes searching mine. Give me the envelope, I said. If the information is as thorough as you say, Francis will draw up the papers. You'll get your protection. But if you try to play both sides, Bridget, remember that I have footage of you from today that would make a prosecutor's eyes light up. She handed me the documents, her hand brushing mine. It felt like ice. He's coming back on Tuesday, Douglas. He thinks that's the day he wins. You'd better be ready. I was born ready, I said, stepping back into my car. I watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the fog. I looked at the heavy envelope on the passenger seat. The manifest was complete. The most dangerous predator in Spencer's life wasn't me, and it wasn't the sharks he owed money to. It was the woman who had shared his bed and watched him plot my downfall. The weakest link had snapped. Spencer Merritt was officially sailing into a harbor where the mines were already active. Since you've made it this far, why not share your theories in the comments about what's coming? I'd love to see who's still following this intense journey. Just a quick reminder, to enhance the storytelling, we've included some fictional elements that aren't based on real facts. If that's not your cup of tea, feel free to stop here. The air inside the house on Wentworth Street was thick with the scent of slow-cooked beef, red wine, and Rosemary Miriam's signature stew. For 4 decades, this smell meant safety and family. Tonight, it was the scent of a funeral pyre for my son's ambitions. Exactly 4 weeks had passed since that first dinner in Sussex. 28 days of tactical maneuvers, legal fortification, and gathering the wreckage of a broken legacy. Outside, a freezing rain lashed against the bay windows, turning the world into a blurred mess of gray and black. Inside, the dining table was set with the good china, the silver polished to a mirrored finish that reflected the flickering candlelight. Spencer and Bridget arrived at 6:30 p.m. Spencer looked frantic, his eyes bloodshot, his movements jerky. The pressure from the city's shadow lenders must have been reaching a breaking point. Bridget, by contrast, was a statue of forced neutrality. We didn't look at each other. The envelope she had given me in the Sobeys parking lot was already in the hands of Francis Whitfield, but tonight the physical proof sat in my study, waiting for its cue. "You've gone to a lot of trouble, Dad," Spencer said, his voice thin and high-pitched. He didn't even take off his coat before sitting down. He looked at the stew as if it were a distraction he didn't have time for. "It's a special night, Spencer," I replied, my voice as calm as a harbor before the tide turns. "Well, a man should eat well when he's about to make a big transition. Isn't that what you've been saying?" Bridget sat down, her hands folded neatly on the lace tablecloth. "It smells wonderful, Douglas, just like Miriam used to make." Miriam had a way of bringing things to the surface, I said, serving the plates. She knew that if you simmer anything long enough, the truth eventually rises to the top. The dinner was a masterclass in agonizing silence. The only sounds were the clinking of silverware and the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. I watched Spencer. He was barely eating. He kept reaching into his inner jacket pocket, feeling for the weight of the manila folder he'd brought the final papers that would, in his mind, sign over my life to the Moncton care home and put the keys of this house in his trembling hands. He thought he was the hunter. He thought I was the cargo that had finally lost its value. I saw him glance at Bridget, looking for the signal of my confusion. I gave it to him one last time. I let my fork slip from my hand, clattering loudly against the china. I stared at the wall for 5 long seconds, my mouth hanging slightly open. Spencer seized the moment like a starving dog. He didn't even wait for dessert. He reached into his coat and slammed the folder onto the table right next to his half-empty wine glass. "Dad, we need to do this now," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of desperation and predatory excitement. "We talked to the director in Moncton. The room is ready. If we don't sign these papers tonight, you lose the spot. You saw what happened with the medication, Dad. You saw the Blue Jays incident. You aren't safe here anymore. Please. For the family. Just sign." He pushed a heavy gold-trimmed pen toward me. It was the same pen I had given him when he graduated from university. A gift for a man I thought was going to build something. Now it was the tool he intended to use to bury me. I looked at the folder. Then I looked at Bridget. She was staring at her plate, her face unreadable. Finally, I looked at my son. I saw the Panama flight ticket in his mind. I saw the $400,000 debt that was breathing down his neck. I saw the man who was willing to leave his children and his father in the wreckage so he could run toward a temporary son. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I reached for my plate and pushed it slowly, deliberately to the side. The screech of the ceramic against the wood felt like a gunshot in the silent room. The confused look vanished from my face. I sat up straight, the years of retirement falling away, replaced by the iron-willed authority of the man who once commanded 300 longshoremen in a blizzard. "The Blue Jays play baseball," Spencer Torai said, my voice dropping into a register that made him flinch. "And the Sea Dogs play soccer." "I know that. I've always known that." Spencer froze, his hand still resting on the folder. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the manifest," I said. "You see, in port operations, we have a term for what you're trying to do. It's called barratry, the fraudulent act of a master or crew to the prejudice of the owner. You've been trying to scuttle my ship, Spencer, but you forgot one thing." I reached under the table and pulled out a heavy black leather folder, the one Francis Whitfield had finalized only hours ago. I placed it on the table directly on top of his guardianship papers. "I'm still the master of this port," I whispered. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear Spencer's ragged breathing. He looked at my folder, then at me, the first flickers of genuine terror beginning to dawn in his eyes. He realized then that the 4 weeks of confusion hadn't been his victory. They had been his trial, and the verdict was sitting right in front of him. "What is this?" he stammered, his hand reaching for my folder. "That," I said, leaning back and crossing my arms, "is the end of your game. It's the irrevocable trust, the medical certification of my total sanity, and a complete audit of your offshore gambling debts provided by a very reliable source." I glanced at Bridget. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a grim, unspoken acknowledgement. Spencer's head whipped toward his wife, then back to me. The realization that his own wife had turned the tide against him hit him like a physical blow. He turned gray, his mouth working, but no sound coming out. "Now," I said, the candlelight glinting off the steel in my eyes, "let's discuss the new terms of your residency in this family. Because the manifest has been rewritten, and Spencer, you are no longer listed as essential cargo." The silence in the dining room was no longer heavy. It was absolute, like the vacuum left in the wake of a massive engine failing. Spencer's hand trembled as he reached for the black leather folder I had placed before him. He opened it slowly, his eyes darting across the first page. I watched the color drain from his face, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor that made him look like a ghost inhabiting a living man's clothes. Inside weren't just legal documents. There were high-resolution stills from the hidden camera showing Bridget stealing my blood pressure medication. There were copies of his offshore betting ledgers, highlighting the $400,000 deficit. And at the very top was the blue-embossed medical certification of my total mental competence from the Fredericton specialists. But it was the final document, the one with Bridget's signature on a statement, detailing his secret plan to flee to Panama, that finally broke him. Spencer's head snapped toward his wife. Bridget didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, her face a mask of iron. She had chosen her side, and it wasn't his. This is a setup." Spencer stammered, his voice cracking like thin ice. "Dad, you can't. This isn't legal." "It's more than legal, Spencer," I said, my voice resonating with the cold authority of 31 years on the docks. "The Merritt Family Legacy Trust is fully active. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, this house on Wentworth Street, my accounts and every cent I own belong to a legal entity that you cannot touch. Nadine is the co-trustee. You are officially listed as excluded cargo. But we're not here to discuss your failed takeover. We're here to discuss your exit from this harbor." I pulled a final set of papers from the back of the folder and slid them across the lace tablecloth. These were the terms of his surrender. Option 1. I stated, ticking a finger. You sign these documents. You formally renounce any and all future claims to my estate. You sign a confession of the forgery and the medication theft documents that Francis Whitfield will keep in a secure vault. You leave this house, you leave St. John, and you never attempt to contact me or my grandchildren again without Nadine's expressed permission. In exchange, the trust will make a one-time anonymous payment to settle your primary debt with the people in this city, not because I care about your skin, but because I won't have my grandkids looking for their father at the bottom of the bay. Spencer looked at the papers as if they were white-hot coals. And option 2. Option 2. I said, and for the first time in weeks, I let a small, grim smile touch my lips. I pick up that phone. I call the regional police. I hand them the video of the medication theft and the evidence of your financial fraud. By midnight, you'll be in a cell. By next month, you'll be in a federal facility. Your debt won't disappear, Spencer. The people you owe will still be waiting when you get out. And trust me, they are much less patient than I am. The silence returned deeper this time. Spencer looked at Bridget, searching for a spark of the loyalty they had once shared while plotting my downfall. He found nothing. He looked at the house, the Victorian treasure he had already sold in his mind, and realized he was a stranger in his own home. He was a man who had tried to play a master's game with a beginner's hand. "You're my father," he whispered, a desperate, pathetic attempt at a guilt trip. "How can you do this to your own son? A father protects his family." I replied, my voice hard as granite. "I spent my life building a harbor for you. I spent 30 years making sure your path was clear, and you responded by trying to bury me alive while my wife's letter was still sitting in the basement, warning me about your greed. You didn't just betray me, Spencer. You betrayed Miriam. You betrayed the very name you carry." I pushed the gold-trimmed pen toward him, the one I had given him when he graduated. "Sign, now, or the tide comes in." Spencer's spirit seemed to physically collapse. The predatory arrogance he had carried since the Sussex dinner evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, broken shell of a man. With a hand that shook so violently, the pen clattered against the china he signed. Page after page. Confession, renunciation, exile. When he finished, he dropped the pen. It rolled across the table and fell to the floor with a hollow click. "Get out." I said the words as final as a birthing order. Spencer stood up. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Bridget. He walked toward the door, his shoulders slumped. He was a ship with a broken rudder drifting into a dark Atlantic night with no coordinates and no fuel. The man who thought he could coordinate a coup against a port manager had ended up being the only casualty of his own war. Bridget stood up slowly. She looked at me, a flicker of respect crossing her face. "I'll handle the kids," she said quietly. "I'll tell them he's going away for work for a long time. Make sure they know they always have a home here," I told her. "But remember our deal, Bridget. You're on probation. If I see even a shadow of Spencer's greed in you, the trust closes its doors." She nodded once and followed him out. The heavy oak door clicked shut. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the sound of their SUV driving away into the freezing rain. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't a lonely silence. It was the peaceful, ordered silence of a ship that had finally weathered the storm. I walked back into the dining room, extinguished the candles, and looked at the bowl of Miriam's stew. I went to my study and picked up her photo. "The manifest is clear, Miriam," I whispered. "The cargo is safe. The harbor is secure." I sat in my leather chair and looked out at the lights of St. John. I was 70 years old, clear-headed, and utterly free. The master of the port was officially off the clock, and for the first time in years, the horizon looked bright. The freezing rain continued to drum against the Victorian glass of the house on Wentworth Street. But inside the dining room, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The moment Spencer dropped the pen in total surrender, the heavy oak front door opened. Frances Whitfield stepped into the hallway, her trench coat slick with rain, followed by a somber-looking man carrying a leather briefcase and a heavy embossing seal. He was a notary public, the final witness to the erasure of my son's status in this family. Frances didn't offer a polite greeting. She moved with the clinical precision of a surgeon arriving at a terminal operation. She signaled the notary to set up his station at the far end of the mahogany table right next to the bowl of Miriam's cold stew. The juxtaposition was jarring the warmth of a mother's legacy, sitting inches away from the cold machinery of legal destruction. "Mr. Merritt," Frances said, her voice a cool blade that sliced through Spencer's remaining delusions. "We are here to finalize the manifest. Everything you have signed tonight must now be sworn under oath and witnessed. The window for negotiation has closed, the tide has moved out, and you are officially grounded." Spencer looked up, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Frances, you've known me since I was a kid. You can't let him do this. He's not himself. He's confused." Frances didn't even blink. She opened her briefcase and pulled out the finalized deed for the Wentworth property. "On the contrary, Spencer, your father is more himself than I have seen him in a decade. He is a man protecting his harbor from a pirate. Now place your hand on the documents." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in legal erasure. The notary worked with a rhythmic, mechanical efficiency. The dry, scratching sound of the pen and the heavy thump of the official seal echoed like gavel strikes in the silent house. Spencer was forced to swear that he was signing of his own free will, that he understood he was renouncing every cent of his inheritance, and that he acknowledged his fraudulent actions regarding my medication and my private finances. I stood by the fireplace, my arms crossed, watching the light from the dying embers reflect off the notary's silver seal. I wasn't an old man suffering from incidents anymore. I was the master of the port, overseeing the final offloading of a contaminated cargo. Every stamp of the seal was a bolt being driven into the door that separated Spencer from my life. It was cold, it was bloodless, and it was entirely necessary. "It is done," Frances said, finally sliding the heavy stack of papers toward me. "Chatitoman." The Merritt Family Legacy Trust is now the sole legal owner of this property, all associated accounts, and the ancestral land in Prince Edward Island. As of this second, Spencer Merritt is a legal stranger to this estate. He has no standing, no claim, and no right of entry. She turned toward my son, her gaze icy. "Spencer, I have already prepared a temporary restraining order based on the evidence of elder abuse and theft. If you are found within 500 meters of this house or your father after tonight, the regional police will not ask questions. They will simply escort you to the facility we discussed." Spencer stood up, his legs shaking so violently he had to lean against the table for support. He looked at the house he had already sold in his mind to cover his debts, and realized it was no longer his future. It was a fortress that had successfully repelled his invasion. "I have nothing," he whispered, the reality of his ruin finally sinking in. "I have nowhere to go." "You have exactly what you negotiated for yourself," I said, stepping forward. I moved into the circle of light at the table, looking my son directly in his hollow eyes. "You have your life, which is more than the people you owe would have given you. And you have the chance to start over somewhere where the name Merritt doesn't mean anything. Because in this city, you have officially been erased from the manifest." Spencer reached into his pocket and pulled out his ring of keys. He looked at them for a long time, the keys to the front door, the keys to the shed where I kept my garden tools, the keys to a life he had tried to steal. "The keys, Spencer." I said, my hand outstretched. He placed them in my palm. They were cold, the metal biting into my skin. For 30 years, I had held his hand, guided his path, and opened doors for him. Tonight, I was the one locking them. "Your voyage ends here, Spencer." I said the words, heavy and final. "You tried to coordinate a coup in my harbor. You tried to turn my own mind against me. But you forgot that a manager knows every inch of his territory. You're dismissed. Get out of my house before I change my mind about the police." Spencer didn't say another word. He turned and walked toward the door, his silhouette disappearing into the dark, rainy hallway. The sound of the front door closing for the last time felt like the final click of a massive lock. Frances exhaled a long, controlled breath of professional satisfaction. She handed me the leather folder containing the sworn confessions and the trust documents. "He's gone, Douglas. The blockade is permanent." I stood alone in the dining room after they left. I looked at the keys in my hand, then at the empty chair. The storm outside was still raging, but for the first time in years, I felt a profound, unshakable peace. The manifest was clean, the cargo was safe, and I was still the master of my own fate. The clock in the hallway struck 1 a.m., its rhythmic chime usually a source of comfort, but tonight it was punctuated by a violent, jagged thud. Someone was hitting the heavy oak front door of Wentworth Street. Not a knock, a desperate, drunken assault. Then came the screaming. It was Spencer's voice, but it had lost all its polished Sussex refinement. It was raw screeching and fueled by a volatile mix of cheap whiskey and terminal desperation. "Open the door, you old vulture, you can't do this. You're hiding behind paper, but you're still my father. Give me the money, Douglas. Those people, they're coming for me tonight. Do you hear me? They're coming to erase me." I was in my study, a glass of water in one hand and the heavy wooden cane I usually reserved for icy walks in the other. I didn't feel the panic Spencer was likely hoping for. I felt a cold, familiar clarity. This was no different than the dock riots of '84 when a group of desperate men tried to storm the manager's office with iron bars. You don't respond to chaos with more chaos. You respond with the stillness of the mountain. I walked to the hallway, the floorboards creaking familiar greetings. I didn't look through the peephole. I didn't need to. I reached for the deadbolt, the new one Frances had installed, and turned it. I pulled the door open and stepped out onto the porch into the biting North Atlantic night. The cold November rain was a mist of needles under the orange street lamps. Spencer was there, huddled against a pillar. His expensive wool coat was stained, his hair matted, and his eyes were wide, bloodshot orbs of pure terror. He smelled of sweat and bottom-shelf bourbon. When he saw me, he lunged forward, but I planted the rubber tip of my cane firmly on his chest. It wasn't a violent strike, it was a physical blockade. "One step back, Spencer," I said. My voice was low, echoing off the stone walls with a vibration that made him flinch. "You've already been erased from the manifest. You are trespassing on private property." "Venture capital!" He screamed, his spittle hitting my cheek. "That house. Miriam's house. You're sitting on $500,000 while they're going to end me. Give me the keys, Dad. Just one account. I'll go to Panama. You'll never see me again." He collapsed to his knees on the wet porch, sobbing now. It was the most pathetic display of human failure I had ever witnessed. This was the man who had tried to convince the world I was the one losing my mind. This was the scavenger trying to pick the bones of a legacy he hadn't built. "Look at yourself," I said, looking down at him with a gaze that felt like a winter tide. "You spent 20 years trying to be a predator, but you were always just a scavenger. You didn't want a legacy. You wanted a payout. You didn't want a father. You wanted an ATM. You tried to turn my own mind into a prison for your profit, and now you're surprised that the doors are locked. I'm your son, he wailed, grabbing at my trousers with his muddy hands. No, I replied, and the word was a gavel strike. My son was a boy I taught to navigate the stars. He's gone. You are just a contaminated shipment that missed its docking window. You tried to coordinate a coup against the only man who truly knew your worth, and in doing so, you proved you have none. I leaned in closer, my face inches from his. The people you owe. They aren't my problem. Your debt is a manifest you signed alone. You chose to gamble with your family's honor, and you lost. Now, get off my porch before I treat you like the intruder you are. Spencer tried to stand, his face contorting into a mask of drunken rage. He raised a fist, a desperate, clumsy move, but I was the man who had survived 31 years of harbor brawls. I didn't even raise my cane. I simply stared him down with a gaze so cold it seemed to freeze the rain in the air. He faltered. The last of his courage, if he ever had any, vanished into the fog. At that moment, a pair of headlights swept across the yard. A St. John police patrol car pulled into the driveway, its blue and red lights painting the Victorian house in rhythmic flashes of authority. 2 officers stepped out. One of them was Miller Wallace Ingram's godson. Wallace had kept his word. The perimeter was being monitored. "Mr. Merritt, everything okay here?" Miller asked, his hand resting on his utility belt. "Just a trespasser, Miller," I said, never taking my eyes off Spencer. "He's been served with a restraining order, but it seems he's had a bit too much to drink and lost his way. Please escort him to the station, and make sure the paperwork for the violation is filed by morning." Spencer didn't fight as they pulled him up. He looked like a bag of wet laundry. As Miller led him toward the cruiser, Spencer turned back one last time, his mouth working, trying to find one last insult, one last manipulation. "You'll be alone in that big house, Douglas," he shouted. "You'll rot in there alone." "I'm never alone, Spencer," I replied as I stepped back inside the threshold. "I have my mind, I have my dignity, and I have the peace of knowing you'll never darken this door again." I closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I watched the patrol car pull away, its lights disappearing into the dark night. Spencer Merritt was gone, carried away into the legal erasure he had earned. I walked back to my study and sat in the chair. The house was quiet. The harbor was secure. I picked up my glass of water and took a sip. My hands were perfectly steady. The final confrontation was over, and the master of the port was finally truly at rest. The morning after the storm arrived, with a sky so clear it looked like polished glass. The biting rain of the night before had been replaced by a crisp, silent cold that turned the puddles on Wentworth Street into sheets of black ice. I woke up at my usual hour, 5:30 a.m., but for the first time in months, the weight on my chest, that heavy, suffocating expectation of betrayal, was gone. The harbor was still. The blockade was complete. I stepped out onto the front porch, a broom and a bucket of warm, soapy water in my hands. The evidence of Spencer's final collapse was everywhere. Muddy footprints marred the white wooden stairs, and a decorative flower pot had been overturned in his drunken lunge. To anyone else, it was just dirt. To me, it was the residue of a sickness that had tried to claim this house. I worked slowly, methodically. I swept away the grit and scrubbed the stone where he had knelt and begged for the money he hadn't earned. As the soapy water washed over the porch, I felt a profound sense of cleansing. In port operations, after a hazardous shipment is removed, you don't just close the gate, you decontaminate the berth. You ensure that no trace of the poison remains to infect the next vessel. By the time the sun began to prick through the horizon, the porch was spotless, but the house still held his ghost. I went back inside and moved through the rooms like an auditor. In the den, I found the spare chargers he had left behind. In the hallway closet, an old jacket he'd forgotten years ago. In the study, the manila folder he had tried to force upon me, now empty of its power. I gathered it all, every scrap of paper, every physical reminder of the man who had tried to turn my own mind into a commodity. I didn't burn them. I didn't throw a tantrum. I simply placed them in heavy black garbage bags and set them by the curb. It was a cold, clinical erasure. I was offloading the last of the contaminated cargo. By the time the garbage truck made its rounds, Spencer Merritt would be nothing more than a redacted line in the long manifest of this house. The emptiness that followed was vast, but it wasn't the emptiness of loss. It was the emptiness of a clean slate. I walked into Miriam's kitchen and began the ritual of the morning. I ground the beans, the scent of dark roast filling the space where Spencer and Bridget had practiced their gaslighting. I cleaned the stove, wiping away the splatters of the checkmate dinner. The house felt larger now. The shadows in the corners no longer felt like hiding places for secrets. They were just shadows. I realized then that the price of freedom is often a specific kind of loneliness, a silence that you have to learn to inhabit. Spencer had warned me I would rot in here alone. He was wrong. To be alone is not the same as to be lonely. I was surrounded by the integrity of the life I had built with Miriam. I was surrounded by the echoes of 31 years of honest labor. I took my coffee and walked to the large bay window that looked out toward the Bay of Fundy. The tide was out, exposing the jagged, salt-crusted rocks of the shoreline. The low tide reveals everything: the hidden debris, the lost anchors, the true shape of the land. My life was at low tide now. The pretense was gone. The family masks had been stripped away, and what remained was solid. I thought of Nadine in Calgary. I thought of Silas and Celia, and the trust fund I had secured for them, a harbor they could sail into when they realized their father had lost his way. I had protected the legacy. I had kept the Wentworth house from becoming a gambling chip in a desperate man's game. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, the warmth of the mug seeping into my palms. My hands were perfectly steady. The incidents, the confusion, the episodes, they had all been tools in a war I hadn't asked for. But they had proven one thing: the engine was still running at peak capacity. I was 70 years old, and I was the master of my own fate. The sun finally broke over the water, a brilliant, blinding orange that turned the bay into a sheet of hammered gold. I watched the first container ship of the day inching toward the piers, its silhouette sharp against the morning light. Life at the port was continuing. The manifests were being signed, the cargo was moving, and the tides were shifting. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun hit my face through the glass. I could almost hear Miriam's voice in the quiet hum of the refrigerator, a soft whisper of approval. "The cargo is safe, Miriam," I murmured. I took a sip of my coffee. It was strong, bitter, and exactly the way I liked it. I wasn't rotting. I wasn't fading. I was simply at rest, watching the world begin again from the safety of a harbor that was finally truly mine. The voyage of the last 4 weeks had been the hardest of my life, but the destination was worth every storm. I was Douglas Merritt. I was clear-eyed. I was free. And as the sun climbed higher into the New Brunswick sky, I knew that the manifest of my life was exactly where it needed to be. The silence of the house on Wentworth Street, which had been my fortress for the last few days, was finally broken, not by an assault, but by a symphony. It began with the distant hum of a taxi in the driveway, followed by the frantic, joyful staccato of small feet hitting the pavement. I stood by the door, no longer gripping a cane for defense, but with arms open and a heart that felt lighter than it had in decades. Nadine was the first through the door, her face radiant with a mixture of relief and fierce pride. Behind her, Silas and Celia erupted into the hallway like a surge of fresh tide. The air, which had felt sterile and audited for so long, was suddenly charged with the chaotic, beautiful energy of childhood. The scent of Calgary's cold mountain air still clung to their coats, mixing with the lavender and cedar of my home. "Grandpa!" Silas shouted, throwing himself at my knees. Celia, always the more observant one, followed with a hug that felt like a bridge being rebuilt over troubled waters. "Welcome home," I whispered, and for the first time, the word home didn't just refer to the stone and mortar of the building. It referred to the people inside it. The following days were a masterclass in healing. Nadine didn't ask for a detailed recount of the final dinner or the confrontation on the porch. She had seen the legal manifest and the video files Francis had shared. Instead, she helped me move the furniture, shifting the heavy oak chairs to catch the winter sun, literally and figuratively reconfiguring the space to erase the lingering shadows of her brother's greed. "You did the right thing, Dad," she said one afternoon as we sat in the kitchen watching the children play in the yard. "You didn't just protect the house. You protected the memory of what this family is supposed to be. Spencer made his choice, but he doesn't get to take our future with him." I gat jow watching Silas. The boy was 7 now, with a curiosity that reminded me of my own younger days at the port. I called him over to the heavy wooden table in the den where my old shipping journals and lengths of nautical rope lay waiting. "Come here, Silas," I said, my voice steady and warm. "I want to show you something that every Merit needs to know. It's called a bowline, the king of knots. It's what keeps the ships secure when the Atlantic tries to pull them away." I watched his small, nimble fingers mirror my aged, scarred ones. We worked together, the rope twisting and looping in a rhythmic dance. I wasn't just teaching him a physical skill. I was teaching him the importance of a connection that holds under pressure. I was teaching him that a knot is only as strong as the intent behind it. "See that, Silas? It never slips, but it's always easy to untie when the voyage is ready to continue. That's integrity. That's how we hold things together." Silas looked up at me, his eyes wide with a newfound respect for the craft. "Will you teach me the others, Grandpa, the ones for the big container ships?" Which was every single one, I promised, as long as the tide keeps coming in. As the week progressed, the house on Wentworth Street transformed. The kitchen was once again a place of laughter and spilled flour, not whispered conspiracies. Celia found Miriam's old music box in the attic and kept it playing, the delicate chimes weaving through the rooms and cleaning out the last of the silence. We ate dinners that were loud, messy, and full of stories about the mountains in the west and the ships in the east. Nadine spent hours in the study with me, not as an auditor, but as a partner. We organized the trust, ensuring the kids' education was ironclad and that the property was preserved for the generation that would actually cherish it. She supported my decision to remain in the house, realizing that the incidents Spencer had fabricated were nothing more than ghosts. "This harbor is yours, Dad," she told me on their final night before heading back. And now, it's a harbor for them too. The night they left the house felt quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the peaceful silence of a well-maintained engine after a long voyage. I walked through the rooms, extinguished the lights, and looked at the photo of Miriam on my desk. I could see the reflection of Silas's practice rope sitting next to the frame. I walked to the bay window and looked out at the lights of St. John. The container ships were still moving, their navigation lights blinking like slow, deliberate heartbeats against the dark horizon. I realized that my life wasn't just a closed manifest. It was an ongoing voyage. Spencer was a storm that had passed, a navigational error that had been corrected. What remained was the strength of the old guard and the promise of the new. I sat in my chair and took a slow breath of the cold, clean air coming through the cracked window. The house on Wentworth Street was once again a place of warmth, of knots that wouldn't slip, and of a legacy that had been successfully offloaded to the right hands. I was Douglas Merritt. I was 70 years old. I was the master of the port, and my harbor was finally truly full of life. The manifest was complete. The cargo was safe, and the continuation had begun. The wind off the Bay of Fundy carried the sharp, familiar bite of salt and diesel, the perfume of a lifetime spent on the edge of the world. I sat on a weathered timber piling at the far end of Pier 12, my boots scuffed, and my hands resting on the silver head of my cane. Beside me, Wallace Ingram was busy nursing a thermos of coffee that smelled like it could dissolve a steel hull. We didn't say much at first. When you've spent 40 years coordinating the arrival of giants, you learn that the most important things are often said in the gaps between the waves. The harbor was busy today. A Neo-Panamax vessel was being guided toward the berth by 3 tugs, their engines churning the gray water into white froth. It was a delicate dance of physics and patience, a reminder that order in this world is something you have to fight for day after day, manifest after manifest. You look like a man who finally cleared a difficult shipment. Douglas Wallace said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the wind. "The cargo is off the dock." "Wally," I replied, watching a crane hoist a red container into the air. "The blockade is lifted, but the harbor feels different now. Lighter, perhaps." We talked about the ships that had gone, the old steamships, the legendary strikes of the 70s, and the men who had stood on these very timbers before us. We talked about the ghosts of the St. John waterfront, the ones who had taught us that a man is only as good as the word he signs on a bill of lading. And eventually, the conversation turned to the people who remained. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small blue-bound booklet. It was the charter for the Miriam Merritt Maritime Scholarship. It was the final destination for the money I had found in the basement, the secret shield Miriam had left me. I had worked with Francis Whitfield to ensure the structure was unbreakable. It wasn't just a donation, it was a logistics plan for the future. "I'm setting this up for the children of the longshoremen," I said, handing the booklet to Wallace. "To the ones who want to study engineering, logistics, or law. The kids who have the grit of the docks but need a fair wind to get moving. I want to make sure the Merritt name stands for a ladder, not a wall." Wallace adjusted his spectacles and flipped through the pages. A small, rare smile touched his weathered face. "And the oversight. You know how some of these committees can get when there's a scent of cash in the air. It's an irrevocable trust, Wally. Nadine is the chair. Francis is the legal sentry. Not a single cent can be touched by anyone with a debt or a hidden agenda. I spent the last month learning how to build a vault that even a master locksmith couldn't crack. I'm making sure this legacy stays in the right hands. No gamblers, no scavengers, just the kids who are willing to work the night shift to get ahead." Wallace nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of respect. "Miriam would have loved this, Doug. She always said the harbor was a family even when the family was fighting." "She saw the cracks before I did," I admitted, looking out at the horizon where the gray water met the steel sky. I was so busy looking at the radar that I forgot to check the hull for rot. But the rot is gone now. The ship has been dry docked, repaired, and the manifest is clean. We sat in silence for another 20 minutes, watching the Neo-Panamax finally touch the fenders with a sound like a distant drum. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long orange shadows across the concrete piers. I felt a profound sense of contentment, a quiet, humming satisfaction that was far deeper than the hollow victory I had felt on the night of the checkmate dinner. This wasn't just about winning a war against a wayward son. It was about ensuring that the merit voyage continued. It was about taking the darkness of Spencer's betrayal and turning it into a beacon for someone else's child. It was the ultimate act of coordination, moving resources from a place of pain to a place of hope. The young ones think they've got it all figured out with their tablets and their automated systems, Wallace muttered, standing up and stretching his aching back. They think experience is just a file you can download. I stood up beside him, my legs feeling strong and my mind as sharp as a winter morning. I looked at the vast, churning expanse of the Atlantic, the same ocean that had tried to break me a dozen times and failed. I felt the weight of the scholarship booklet in my hand, a physical anchor for my soul. Let them think that, I said, a small, knowing smile on my face. But when the fog rolls in and the sensors fail, they'll still need the ones who know how to read the tide by the smell of the air. I looked at Wallace, my ally, my witness, my friend. We were the old guard, the ones who had held the line while the world changed around us. We had weathered the betrayal of our own blood and the erosion of time, and yet we were still standing on the pier. We've grown old, Wallace, I said, my voice steady and full of a hard-won peace. Our joints creak and our manifests are nearly full, but we've never been useless. Not for a single second. No, Wallace agreed, looking out at the arriving ship. We're just on the next watch, Douglas, watching the horizon so the kids can sleep soundly. I walked back toward my car, the sound of my cane on the concrete, a rhythmic, confident beat. The Merit legacy wasn't a pile of gold in a Sussex vault. It was a scholarship, a sturdy house on Wentworth Street, and a grandfather who knew exactly who he was. The tide was coming in. The harbor was secure, and for the first time in my 70 years, the manifest was truly complete. The morning light of April the 2026 filtered through the pristine glass of my study, casting a soft golden glow over the mahogany desk. For the first time in many months, perhaps years, I looked at the silver-framed photograph of Miriam and didn't feel the sharp, jagged edge of grief. Instead, I felt a warm, steady hum of accomplishment. I looked at her eyes, those perceptive sea-gray eyes that had seen the rot in our son long before I did, and I smiled. It wasn't the grim, tactical smile of a man winning a war. It was the quiet, effortless smile of a man who had finally brought his ship to a safe berth. We did it, Miriam, I whispered to the quiet room. The harbor is clear. The manifest is closed. The journey from that cold October night in Sussex to this warm April morning had been the most grueling voyage of my 70 years. I had started as a target, a man considered cargo by his own blood, a set of assets to be liquidated, a mind to be gaslit into a managed decline. I had been a victim of the worst kind of betrayal, the kind that wears the mask of concern. But as I sat there watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the trust or the scholarship, or even the evidence that had sent Spencer into a permanent legal exile. The greatest victory was the reclamation of my own sovereignty. In the world of port logistics, we talk a lot about control. We control the cranes, the tides, the schedules, and the bills of lading. But we often forget to control the narrative of our own lives. Spencer and Bridget had tried to write a story where I was the fading light, the confused elder, the obstacle to their quick payout. I had allowed them to start that story, using their own arrogance against them, acting as the confused old man until the trap was set. But the lesson I learned in the dark corners of this house was simple. Freedom is not something given to you by your children, your government, or your history. Freedom is something you possess only as long as you have the courage to defend it with every tool at your disposal. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, the skin thin like parchment, but the grip still capable of holding a nautical knot or a legal pen. I thought about the people who might be listening to this chronicle, those who feel the fog of someone else's greed closing in around them, those who are told they are past their prime or incidental to the world's progress. My message to them is this: a manager never abdicates his post just because the weather gets rough. You are the master of your own manifest until the very last line is signed. Respect is earned through a lifetime of integrity, but self-respect is maintained through the refusal to be victimized. I had to become a predator to defeat a scavenger, and while the process was cold and clinical, it was the only way to ensure that Miriam's legacy didn't end up as a pile of digital chips on a gambling server in a foreign land. I stood up and walked toward the back door, my cane tapping a rhythmic, confident beat on the polished floorboards. Outside, the New Brunswick spring was arriving with a stubborn, cold beauty. The snow had finally melted from the garden beds, exposing the rich, dark earth that had been sleeping under the frost. This year, the garden wouldn't be a chore. It would be a celebration. I had already ordered the seeds for the heirloom tomatoes, the deep red beefsteaks, and the sweet yellow cherries that Miriam loved. I had the stakes ready, the irrigation planned, and the time to watch them grow. There is something profoundly honest about a garden. You cannot gaslit a tomato plant. You cannot forge a harvest. It requires truth, patience, and the right environment, much like a well-run harbor. Nadine would be back in June with Silas and Celia. We would spend the long Atlantic afternoons on the porch, teaching the kids the difference between a spring tide and a neap tide, and perhaps I would start Silas on his first shipping journal. The Merritt name was no longer a weight around my neck. It was a flag I was proud to fly. Spencer was gone. I didn't know where he was, Panama perhaps, or some bleak apartment in a city where no one knew his name. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate is a heavy cargo that slows the ship down. I had offloaded him. He was a redacted entry, a navigational error that had been corrected. I had given him the ultimate mercy, the consequences of his own choices. I walked to the edge of my property, looking out toward the Bay of Fundy. The tides were moving in their eternal clockwork cycle. The great container ships were appearing on the horizon, their hulls cutting through the gray water with a purpose that I understood in my soul. To those of you who have followed this journey from the Manila folder to the final trust, thank you for standing watch with me. Remember that the fog only wins if you stop moving. Keep your eyes on the horizon. Keep your manifests clean, and never ever let someone else tell you that your voyage is over. If you found strength in this story, share it with another old guard who might be feeling the wind shift against them. Let them know that the master of the port is still on duty. The sun was warm on my face now, the scent of the sea air filling my lungs. I felt a profound, unshakable contentment. My house was secure. My family was protected. My mind was my own. I took a slow, deep breath and smiled at the vast blue horizon. The manifest of Douglas Merritt was open to a new, beautiful page. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just managing the cargo, I was enjoying the view. Safe travels, I whispered to the world. I turned back toward my house, toward the garden, and toward the future. The tide was in, and the harbor was perfect. Looking back at my family story, I realized my greatest error wasn't a failing memory. It was a blinded heart. I spent decades securing the harbor, yet I left my own home unguarded. Don't be like me. Don't wait until you are forced into a cold dad revenge to survive. This family story is a harsh reminder that loyalty is a manifest that must be signed daily. I had to become a predator to protect Miriam's legacy, a path of dad revenge that no father ever wishes to take. Through the fog of betrayal, I found that my sovereignty was my only true anchor. I thank God for giving me the clarity to see the storm before it capsized my soul. In the end, this family story proves that freedom is reclaimed through calculated strength. My Dad Revenge wasn't about hate. It was about the restoration of justice. To anyone facing a similar shadow, stay sharp, stay sovereign, and never let a scavenger dictate your worth. Author's note: I have adapted the narrative and framed the variables. You must modify the bracketed content for each video to prevent industrial spam flags. Closing message: I am truly grateful you walked this long, difficult path with me until the very end. I would value your input. How would you have navigated this specific betrayal, such a high-stakes legal trap? Your perspective matters to me. If this journey resonated with you, please subscribe so we can explore more narratives together. A quick note: while inspired by maritime culture, elder exploitation issues, certain elements were dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this particular style doesn't suit your taste, feel free to browse our other content for a better fit.